He'll tell you a little bit about what we're wearing and a little bit about the guns.
Hello, everyone. My name's Mike, of course, and welcome everyone to the musket demonstration. Hopefully what we'll do for you here is fire off a few volleys from our small arms. But before that, I'll briefly talk about exactly what all of it represents. You might notice we're all wearing something different. I'll start off, however, with the most unique, standoutish, and important man that we have out here. That is Andrew, your tour guide. He's representing a Mohawk warrior of the Iroquois Six Nations Confederacy. They were the largest native group in this area, remain so today, and a great ally of the British in particular, though some did side with the United States, particularly in 1814, because in response to the American burning of modern-day Niagara on the lake, the British captured Fort Niagara and marched all the way down along the river that winter, burning everything they came across, or just about. That included two Tuscarora and Seneca villages. Naturally, the Tuscarora and Seneca were not pleased by this, and about 600 warriors from the Tuscarora and Seneca basically joined up, and they supported the American army that came here in 1814. Now, both sides prized them as scouts, skirmishers, and great shots with a musket. They were often given good quality muskets for that reason. But for the British especially, their primary benefit for British forces was the psychological effect you'd often get out of them. Particularly at the beginning of the war, the American army was inexperienced. Many of them came from the East Coast. These men, say from Boston, they've never actually seen a native warrior before. All they have are the stories they've been raised on. It's about 200 years of racism and propaganda telling you that Andrew here is a 10-foot-tall, fire-breathing monster. Naturally, he's just a person like the rest of us, but if you come here from Boston to the frontier, the Wild West of its time, and you hear war cries coming from the other side of the field, much like that, you hear him before you see him, so the image conjured up in your head is what you were told as a child. And surprisingly enough, this was enough to keep many American soldiers from engaging them. At the Battle of Detroit, the siege of Fort Detroit, a garrison of about 2,000 men were surrendered by their commanding officer simply because he feared a native massacre. That same year, less than 80 native warriors at Queenston Heights kept over 1,000 American regulars and militia from crossing the river, simply because they could hear war cries from the other side and didn't wish to cross. They took their constitutional right to refuse foreign service. If it wasn't for them, this would not be Canada today. This would be the United States. As for the rest of us, we're all representing different kinds of regulars. I'll start off with your normal guys, American and British. Dorcas there on the end is representing a British soldier of the King's 8th Regiment of Foot, one of the oldest regiments in the army. You can tell he's King's 8th because of his plates, his cuffs, his collars, and his taping, all of which tried to mark out regiment from regiment. Next to him, you have Carleton, representing an American soldier of 1813, early 1814. Now, this isn't quite as fancy as the British coat. The traditional American coat would have been a nice bright blue, bright red cuffs and collars, with white taping up and down, much like Jesse there in his artillerist's uniform. Unfortunately, though, this was an expensive uniform to produce when you're at war with not only the greatest naval power in the world, but your primary blue dye supplier. So by 1814, they were trying to make the uniforms a little cheaper. And here, the American army that came across in 1814, many of them didn't actually wear those blue coats. An entire brigade, under the command of Winfield Scott, did not receive their blue coats, or at least not for more than 100 or so men. So they had to very quickly get something that would fit them and that would be uniform. And they chose plain gray roundabout work coats, which the men called slave coats. They didn't particularly like them, but these men were experienced, well-trained, and well-led, and they proved themselves at the siege of Fort Erie as well as Chippewa and Lundy's Lane earlier, and beat the British in stand-up European-style firefights in a way that American forces had not done, at least since the Revolution. So, although they were as well-equipped as their British counterparts, they certainly were by 1814 their equals. Finally, we have two more specialized types of regulars. Jesse there is representing a man of the American artillery. The only thing that really marks him out from a member of the Royal Artillery being his cuffs and collars and the taping. So at a distance, you might understand they could often be confused for one another. They'd be responsible for the guns, naturally, and as such, they'd be expected to know physics, chemistry, and mathematics. They'd have more education than your standard soldier, and before they were allowed anywhere near the guns, they would be trained as a basic infantryman, so they'd know how to operate otherwise without their guns. As for me, I'm representing a rifleman of the 4th U.S. Rifle Regiment. The thing that marks me out from the rest is that I'm carrying a rifle, not a smoothbore. The rifle is rifling grooves machined down the barrel. It grips the ball, gives it a spin, and greatly improves accuracy and range. Unfortunately, it's also about 5 times as expensive to manufacture, takes about 3 times longer to load, and takes 8 months to properly train someone to use properly. With the smoothbore, after 2 months, they're pretty much ready for anything you can throw them into. So unfortunately, this was still a specialist's weapon, although you could get over 300 yards of accuracy with a well-trained man. As for the weapons we will be firing for you, though, we'll be firing smoothbores. Carlton and Dorcas there will show you the 75 caliber Brown Best smoothbore. That's the standard British armament of the time, and all muskets and rifles, in fact, work in pretty much the same way. You'll pour a little bit of powder into this side dish called the pan. You'll then close it up to protect it from the weather, cast about, put everything else down the barrel, at which point you're relying on the very exact science of this little piece of stone here striking that piece of steel, hopefully creating sparks, which might land in the pan, possibly igniting your primer, which, if everything goes right, will ignite the main charge at the base of the gun, which should send your musket ball downrange, possibly into an enemy soldier. You may have noticed a few words I mentioned there, possibly, hopefully, maybe. That's the first major problem with this weapon. It's not very reliable. Even on a clear, calm day like today, with the weapon being clean, statistically, smoothbores and rifles have about a 20% misfire rate. If it's dirty, raining, or the middle of winter, they can become better clubs than firearms. The second major problem with the smoothbores is their accuracy. As I said, past 300 yards, a well-trained rifleman should be able to hit a man-sized target, but with the smoothbore, the shot is smaller than the barrel and the inside is entirely smooth, which means it bumbles its way up and down. Wherever it hits last, it tends to bounce off in the opposite direction. With those past 60 yards, you're only going to hit something if you get very, very lucky. You can kill someone at up to 250 yards with those weapons, but at that range, your margin of error is over 9 feet in any direction around your target. So aiming at long distances is basically impossible. So how do you get around these first two problems? With the smoothbores, it's very simple. You take all your men, like you see behind me, in long lines, shoulder to shoulder, tightly packed groups of men. They march at once, in unison. They point, they fire in the same time, at the same direction. With this, you largely get rid of the first two problems, because if 20% don't go off out of 100 weapons, that's still 80 balls of lead proceeding downfield, at which point you don't need to aim. The wall of lead will do all your aiming for you, even up to 200 yards away. Unfortunately, though, this produces a third and final major problem, and that's the smoke these weapons produce, called the fog of war. You'll see two weapons firing about a tablespoon of gunpowder per shot, and you'll see just how much smoke that creates. You might be able to imagine then that with thousands of muskets, dozens of cannons, some using over 8 pounds of powder per shot, it really didn't take very long before soldiers reported the first time they could see who they were shooting at was about the distance you folks are from our line down. That's a little over 20 paces, and often it was significantly less. At the Battle of Lundy's Lane, in fact, it became so bad that Brigadier General Winfield Scott tried to lead his brigade to outflank the British on their left. He got lost in the smoke and darkness, ended up turning left too quickly, and spent the next 20 minutes marching between the American and British lines of battle, with both pouring fire into his side, because no one could identify them in their plain gray war coats. That, in fact, is why red coats and blue coats are the best kinds of uniforms to be wearing here in 1814, because that easily allows someone, or at least more quickly allows them, to identify you on the field, reducing the chances that your own soldiers will shoot you in the confusion. With that, though, we'll get Jesse to run these guys 2 loads for you.
Whipling cartridge. Load! Handle. Cartridge.
First thing you'll do is take out a paper cartridge filled with gunpowder out of the back, bite off the top of it, and menacingly spit it out to the enemy.
Right.
You then put a little bit of the gunpowder into the pan and close it up to keep it in place and protect it from the elements.
Gas the boat.
You then put everything else down the barrel. That's the powder, the musket ball, and the paper. The paper's there to act as wadding. It keeps the shot in place, as well as gives you a bit of compression.
Draw. Ram it up. Ram down. Cartridge.
At that point, though, you have to make sure everything's firmly seated. With the smoothbores, because the shot is smaller than the barrel, for the first 15, you can reliably just drop it down of its own accord. When you burn black powder, a thick tarry substance called fouling will build up very quickly. After 30 shots, it might go halfway down and spit out, hurting no one. This, however, leads us to another important step.
Return. Ram right.
You have to make sure to put it back. Now, you could shish kebab someone with one of these, and that might seem pretty effective and rather neat. Unfortunately, though, you only get one, and you need it to work the weapon. So, rather than go and ask for it back, which is rather awkward, simply do what your mother always told you. Put it back where you found it. Everything should be fine.
Shoulder arc. Make ready.
At this point, we're ready for our first volley. I'll warn you, real gunpowder, real weapons, it'll make a rather loud noise. If you don't like loud noises, plugging your ears isn't a bad idea. But for those of you with cameras, the best time to hit your trigger is when Jesse yells fire. Hopefully, that's when they'll pull theirs. And if you miss the first, there will be a second.
Set.
Jesse's given them the order to prime and load. That's the standard order out on the field, telling them to load as quickly as possible. You'll also notice that Mike Dorcas there has taken the knee to load his weapon. Most soldiers were trained to do so by this point. In fact, some, like rifles, were trained to load lying down on their backs and stomachs. This can give you better cover from enemy fire, but unfortunately, with a muzzle-loading weapon, the closer it is to the ground, the more cumbersome it is to work with. And because volume of firepower is so important, you would have to stand up historically. But one more shot.
Set.
All right, I think that was 4 for 4. Not bad. Round of applause for them.
Oh,
That's a
they were
pretty good.
great.
Well, I hope you folks enjoyed the demonstration. For those of you on the tour, and just taking inside, show you about the inner workings. As for everyone else, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day here in Old Fort Erie.
And what they're actually firing is a 3-pounder cannon. It's very simple. It fires a 3-pound iron ball. That's how you measure everything at the time, just by weight. Now, it's actually one of the smallest guns you would find. The British preferred not to use them. They thought they were baby guns. They preferred 6-pounders. But if all you've got is 3-pounders, you use 3-pounders. Now, as well as the solid iron ball that everyone is used to, they have a few other variations of shots that they can fire from the gun. One of the simplest ones is what's called hot shot. You take the cannonball, you put it in a furnace, you heat it until it is red hot. You then put it back down the barrel. When you fire it, if it hits something, it sends out a shower of sparks. It can set fire to things. Usually, this is a naval type of ammunition, not usually used by the army. What the army uses, though, is something called canister shot. Very different. This one is actually just a tin can. You take the tin can, you fill it with musket balls. You put the tin can down the barrel, you fire the tin can. There is enough force behind the powder to completely disintegrate the can and send a shower of musket balls out at the enemy. It turns your cannon into a rather large shotgun. When canister shot hits people, it's said to sound like hail when it strikes bits of metal on the guns and on the belting. If it hits people, it's said to sound like fabric tearing. It is not pretty, but it's probably quite quick. Now, what they're actually going through now is the actual loading procedure. Jesse is going to put what's called the worm down the gun. That is to make sure that you've got all the little bits of leftovers from the previous round out. There's nothing else down there. It's a safety step, very important. What Trav is then going to do is what's called swabbing the gun. He takes his massive Q-tip. He gets it a little bit damp. He puts it down the barrel. You will also notice that Mike in the green has his finger over the breech of the gun. That is to create a vacuum. Puts out all of the sparks that are previously in there. Again, a safety step. Now we're getting to the important stuff, though. Jesse has acquired the round. We used tin foil. They probably would have used a burlap sack at the time. Ours keeps its form a little bit better. They're then going to make sure it's all the way to the bottom of the gun by ramming it home with the other end of the Q-tip. Now, they will do it several times to make sure it is properly seated down there, because if it is not, it may not go off, and if it's stuck down there, you have a very unsafe cannon. So now that it's all there, Mike in the green has to make sure that you can get the fire from the little hole at the top down to the main rounds. He's going to take a little spike, shove it through to create a hole in the round, and then put a little quill down. We use a straw with tape and gunpowder. That is a modern thing. They didn't use that. They would have actually have used things such as quills. Just soak them in flammable substances, things like that. Just anything to get the fire from the top down into the gun. They're now getting just about ready to fire. So I will let you know it is a real gun. We use real gunpowder. This one makes a bit of a boom. If you are not fond of loud noises, feel free to cover up your ears. If you want to get a shot with your camera, the best time to hit your trigger is when Jesse touches the back of the gun with his flaming stick. Hopefully that's when everything goes off. I'll just check whether we are clear. We good? Okay. Fire! That's the baby one.